The message came late in the evening, so unexpected that it almost felt like a mistake. It was from Caleb, my best friend Nathan's older brother. Caleb wasn't the type to reach out to anyone. His quiet demeanor and brooding personality made him seem untouchable, almost otherworldly. Growing up, I'd seen him as this unshakable force, strong, silent, and completely out of reach. But now, his name was flashing on my phone, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. Got some work at the farm this weekend. Could use a hand. You free? His message was casual, almost cold, but my heart started racing anyway. Why would Caleb, of all people, be texting me? We weren't exactly close, and yet I couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through me as I read those words over and over. I stared at the screen, debating whether to accept or let it go. But something about Caleb had always drawn me in, and I knew I couldn't say no. Sure, I can come by, I replied, trying to sound indifferent, though my hands trembled slightly as I typed. His response was immediate. See you Friday. The drive to the farmhouse was agonizingly long. The open fields and winding roads gave me too much time to think, and my mind spun with questions. Why now? What could Caleb possibly need from me? By the time I pulled up, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The farmhouse stood against the backdrop of the fading light, a picturesque but slightly weathered relic of simpler times. Caleb was waiting on the porch, leaning against the railing with a beer in hand. He looked exactly the same as I remembered, and yet somehow different. His flannel shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with dirt. His green eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. Then he smiled, a small, barely there curve of his lips, and nodded. You made it. I nodded back, feeling my pulse quicken under his gaze. Wouldn't miss it, I managed, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of pine wood and faint traces of coffee. It felt both familiar and foreign, like stepping into a memory I didn't know I had. Caleb handed me a beer, his fingers brushing against mine for the briefest of moments. I told myself it meant nothing, but the way his touch lingered in my mind said otherwise. As we sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one, he finally spoke again. Got something I've been working on, he said, his voice low and deliberate. I'll show you tomorrow. The weight in his words left me breathless. What was Caleb hiding? And why did it feel like this weekend was about so much more than farm chores? The next morning, I woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the scent of coffee drifting through the air. Caleb was already in the kitchen when I walked in, his back to me as he poured a cup for himself. His presence filled the room in a way that made it hard to breathe. He turned slightly, his gaze meeting mine. Morning, he said, his voice rough from sleep. I nodded, grabbing a cup of coffee for myself. Morning. What's the plan? Eat quick, he said simply. Got something to show you. We headed to the barn, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The old structure loomed ahead, its red paint peeling in places but still sturdy and imposing. Caleb pushed open the barn doors, and the scent of hay and earth surrounded us. He didn't stop there, though. Instead, he led me to a smaller hidden door in the back. My heart raced as he unlocked it, the sound of the latch echoing in the quiet. Inside was a workshop, cluttered with tools and projects in various stages of completion. But it wasn't the mess that caught my attention. It was the massive wooden sculpture in the center of the room. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, raw and stunning in its detail. Two figures intertwined, their bodies reaching for each other with a desperation that was almost palpable. "You made this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, took years." I stepped closer, running my fingers lightly over the smooth curves of the wood. Every detail seemed to tell a story, one of love, loss, and longing. "It's incredible," I said, genuinely in awe. "Why keep it hidden?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because it's not just a sculpture," he said finally. "It's personal." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked at him, searching his face for answers, but he avoided my gaze. "Who are they?" I asked softly. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "It's me," he said, "and him." The vulnerability in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Caleb, who had always seemed so closed off, was standing here, bearing a part of himself I never thought I'd see. And I couldn't help but wonder, who was him? And why did it feel like this moment was just the beginning? The workshop was quiet except for the faint hum of the wind outside. But inside me, a storm was raging. Caleb's words, "It's me and him," echoed in my mind as I tried to process what he had just revealed. He stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. This wasn't just a sculpture. It was a window into Caleb's heart. And now he was trusting me with it. "I didn't know," I said softly, not sure how else to respond. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw emotion carved into the wood, it was so unlike the Caleb I thought I knew. "Of course you didn't," he replied, his tone almost bitter. "Nobody does. I've spent years making sure of that." He glanced at me then, his green eyes sharp yet guarded. "But keeping it in, it's like it's eating me alive." I took a step closer to the sculpture, studying the way the figures seemed to cling to each other, as though the act of letting go would destroy them. Who was he? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I had the right to. Caleb let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Someone who's long gone. Someone I was too scared to hold on to when it mattered." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "He was everything I couldn't admit I wanted. And when he asked me to leave with him, I froze. I chose this place, this life. And he left." The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, and I felt an ache in my chest for him. "I'm sorry," I said, knowing it wasn't enough, but not knowing what else to say. Caleb shrugged, though the gesture felt hollow. "It is what it is. But this," he gestured to the sculpture, "is all I have left of him, of us." I swallowed hard, the intensity of the moment pressing down on me. "Why show me now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable, because for the first time in years, I feel like maybe I don't have to carry it alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Caleb didn't bring up the sculpture again, and I didn't push. Instead, we spent the afternoon working around the farm, mending fences, stacking hay, and clearing out the old chicken coop. The physical labor was exhausting, but it gave me time to think. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were both covered in dirt and sweat. Caleb handed me a beer as we sat on the porch, the cool evening air washing over us. For a while, neither of us said anything. The silence comfortable, but charged. "I didn't expect you to be so open," I admitted finally, breaking the quiet. Caleb glanced at me. one corner of his mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile. I didn't expect to be either. Guess you bring it out of me. The admission caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. Why me? I asked, genuinely curious. He took a long sip of his beer before answering. Because you're different. Always have been. You don't see the world the way everyone else around here does. He paused, his gaze distant. And because I trust you. The sincerity in his voice made my throat tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, to let him know I understood. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, letting my hand brush against his. He didn't pull away. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. It was just the two of us, sitting on that porch, the stars above and the quiet hum of crickets in the background. And for the first time, I felt like maybe this wasn't just about Caleb's past. Maybe it was about something more, something unfolding between us. That night, as the farmhouse grew quiet, I couldn't sleep. Caleb's words, his touch, the way he had looked at me, it was all too much to process. I got out of bed and wandered into the living room, where the faint glow of the fireplace cast shadows on the walls. To my surprise, Caleb was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. I shook my head, sitting down across from him. For a while, we just sat there, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. Finally, Caleb spoke. "You know, I've spent most of my life pretending. Pretending I'm fine. Pretending this farm is enough, but it's not. It never was." His honesty took my breath away. "You don't have to pretend with me," I said quietly. Caleb looked at me then, his green eyes piercing. "I know. That's why I asked you to come here." The weight of his words settled over me, and before I could think, I reached out, my hand finding his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted closer, his gaze dropping to my lips. "This is crazy," he murmured, but there was no hesitation in his voice. "Maybe," I replied, my heart pounding, "but it feels right." And then, before I could second-guess myself, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and urgent. It was like years of tension and longing had built up between us. And now, it was all spilling over. When we finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I've wanted this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've wanted you." The admission sent a thrill through me, but it also scared me. This was Caleb, strong, stoic Caleb, letting his walls down for me. And I knew in that moment that there was no turning back. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the farmhouse windows, casting a golden glow across the room. I blinked awake, my heart skipping a beat as the events of the previous night came rushing back. Caleb's kiss, the way his hands had hesitated before pulling me closer, and the raw emotion in his voice as he whispered things he'd probably never said aloud before. It all felt like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The faint scent of Caleb's cologne lingered on my skin, and when I turned, there he was, standing in the doorway of the guest room. His hair was tousled, his flannel shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the curve of his collarbone. He held 2 mugs of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Morning," I replied, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from my eyes. There was an awkward pause as he walked over and handed me the coffee. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. The weight of what had happened between us the night before seemed to hang in the air. About last night, he began, but I quickly cut him off. It wasn't a mistake, I said firmly, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice, at least not for me. Caleb let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. Good, he said, a small, almost shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Because it wasn't for me either. The tension in the room eased, but only slightly. There was still so much left unsaid, so many questions hovering between us. What did this mean for Caleb? For me? For us? But before I could voice any of them, he straightened, his demeanor shifting back to the Caleb I'd always known. Strong, steady, and composed. Come on, he said, his tone soft but firm. We've got work to do. The sun hung low in the sky as we worked, its golden light stretching over the fields. Caleb and I had fallen into an unspoken rhythm, him leading, me following. Every movement, every task seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite name. The tension from last night lingered between us, unspoken but undeniable. We were repairing the north fence when I finally gathered the courage to speak. Caleb, I began, setting down the hammer. Why did you really ask me to come here? He froze, the tension in his shoulders palpable even from where I stood. He didn't look at me, didn't answer right away. Instead, he drove another nail into the wood with such force that I thought it might splinter. Finally, he let out a breath, the sound heavy with frustration. I told you, he said, his voice clipped. I needed help. Don't do that, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Don't shut me out. Caleb turned to face me then, his green eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something else, something raw and vulnerable. What do you want me to say, huh? He snapped. That I've been drowning in this damn place? That I've spent years pretending everything's fine when it's not? His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I held my ground. Yes, I said, stepping closer. That's exactly what I want you to say. Because I'm here, Caleb. I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, he just stared at me, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Then, his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I don't know why I asked you to come, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I needed someone, and you're the only person I trust. The honesty in his words made my throat tighten. I wanted to say something, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. He didn't pull away. We stood there in the fading light, the air between us heavy with unspoken emotions. And for the first time, I saw the cracks in Caleb's armor. The fear, the pain, the longing he had kept buried for so long. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would do whatever it took to help him heal. That evening, the farmhouse was quiet except for the faint hum of crickets outside. Caleb and I sat by the fire pit, the flames casting flickering shadows across his face. He stared into the fire, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey. I could tell he was building up to something, and I waited, giving him the space he needed. It started when I was 20, he said finally, his voice low and steady. His name was Alex. My chest tightened at the mention of the name, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. We met at a bar in town, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'd gone in for a drink after a long day on the farm. He was sitting at the end of the bar, this cocky grin on his face like he owned the place. He shook his head, the smile fading. I hated him at first. Thought he was arrogant, loud, everything I wasn't. But he didn't care. He just kept talking to me like he saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze distant. We started seeing each other in secret, meeting in places where no one would find us. It was intense, like nothing I'd ever felt before. I could hear the pain in his voice, even as he tried to keep it steady. But then he wanted more, he said, his jaw tightening. He wanted me to leave with him, to build a life together somewhere far away from here. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave the farm, my family, everything I'd ever known. So he left. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of his regret, the years of guilt and longing he had carried with him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd gone with him? I asked softly. Every damn day, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's too late now. He's gone, and I'm still here. The vulnerability in his words made my heart ache for him. It's not too late, I said, reaching out to touch his hand. You can still have the life you want, Caleb. You just have to let yourself believe you deserve it. He looked at me then, his green eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. And what if I don't know what I want anymore? He asked. Then we figure it out together, I said, my voice firm. One step at a time. The first light of dawn crept through the windows of the farmhouse, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, the warmth of the mug grounding me as the crisp morning air filled my lungs. Behind me, the farmhouse felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, like it was no longer just a building, but a part of something bigger. And then I heard the soft creak of the door opening. Caleb stepped out, his hair still damp from a quick shower, his flannel shirt hanging open over a white undershirt. He carried his own mug of coffee, and when he saw me, he smiled. Not the shy, hesitant smile I'd grown used to, but something warmer, more open. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, glancing out at the fields. "Too much on my mind." He leaned against the railing next to me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Good things, I hope," he said, his tone teasing, but his gaze serious. I turned to face him, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't want to leave, Caleb. I don't want this, whatever this is, to just end." He didn't respond right away, and for a moment, panic gripped me. But then he set his mug down and reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "It doesn't have to," he said simply, his green eyes locking onto mine. "I don't know what this is either, but I know I don't want to lose it." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. "Then let's figure it out," I said, squeezing his hand. "One day at a time." The rest of the morning passed in quiet companionship. Caleb showed me around the parts of the farm I hadn't seen yet. The small garden where his mother used to grow vegetables, the pond where he used to fish with his brother, the old oak tree where he'd carved his initials as a kid. Each place held a piece of him, a memory he was willing to share with me. It felt like he was opening up in ways he never had before, and I couldn't help but feel honored to be a part of it. As the sun climbed higher, we found ourselves back at the barn, working side by side to repair an old gate. Caleb was focused on the task at hand, but every so often, his eyes would meet mine, and a small smile would pass between us. It was simple, quiet, but it felt like the beginning of something real. When the gate was finally fixed, Caleb leaned against it, wiping the sweat from his brow. You know, he said, his voice soft, I used to think this place was all I'd ever have, that I'd spend my life alone, just me and the farm. And now? I asked, stepping closer. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Now? I think maybe there's more. The vulnerability in his words hit me hard, and before I could think, I closed the distance between us, pulling him into a kiss. It was slow, tender, and filled with a promise that neither of us had to say aloud. The days that followed were a blur of hard work and quiet moments that felt like stolen treasures. Caleb and I fell into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Mornings were spent tending to the farm, afternoons fixing whatever needed repairs, and evenings sitting by the fire pit, sharing stories and dreams we'd never dared to voice before. One evening, as we sat under the stars, Caleb turned to me, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady but laced with hesitation, about the future, about what I want. And what do you want? I asked, my heart pounding in anticipation. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the flames. I want this farm to mean something again. Not just to me, but to us. I want it to be a place where we can build something together. The weight of his words took my breath away. Caleb, are you saying? I'm saying I want you here, he interrupted, his green eyes locking onto mine. Not just for a weekend, not just for a few days. I want you to stay. The enormity of his offer hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a casual invitation. It was a commitment, a promise of a future we could build together. Are you sure? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I've never been more sure of anything, he said, his voice firm. I've spent too much of my life being afraid of change, of what people would think, of letting someone in. But with you, it's different. You make me want to be better. You make me want more. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I reached out, taking his hand in mine. I want that too, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. I want this, us, to work. The days turned into weeks, and soon my visits to the farmhouse became longer and more frequent. Caleb and I worked together to restore the farm, turning it into something we could both be proud of. The old barn was transformed into a workshop for Caleb's sculptures, a place where his creativity could thrive. The fields, once overgrown, were now lush and vibrant, a testament to the hard work we'd poured into them. But it wasn't just the farm that was changing. Caleb was changing too. He smiled more, laughed more, and allowed himself to dream again. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly home. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caleb turned to me, his expression serious. I never thought I'd find this, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I never thought I'd find someone who made me feel whole. You don't have to thank me for that, I said, smiling. You've always had it in you. You just needed someone to remind you. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You've done more than remind me, he said. You've given me a reason to hope again. And I don't ever want to lose that. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I leaned into Caleb's embrace, my heart full of gratitude and love. We still had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time, I felt like we were truly ready to face it together. This story is more than just a romance. It's an emotional journey of courage, redemption, and self-discovery. Caleb spent most of his life hiding his true self, not just from the world, but from himself. The weight of the choices he made out of fear left deep scars, but they also prepared him for the moment when he would be ready to embrace love again. The protagonist's arrival at the farmhouse symbolizes a turning point in Caleb's life. It's not just about fixing fences or restoring the land. It's about rebuilding his ability to trust, to love, and to be vulnerable. The connection that forms between them isn't instantaneous. It's built slowly through moments of honesty and small gestures of affection and support. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. The most valuable things in life don't happen quickly or easily. They require patience, effort, and courage. Caleb's arc teaches us the importance of confronting our fears and letting go of control. He realizes that he spent years limiting himself because of what others might think. But in the end, he understands that happiness is only possible when we choose to live our truth. It challenges us to reflect. How often do we hold ourselves back, fearing the judgment of others? And what if, like Caleb, we allowed ourselves to be truly free? On the other hand, the protagonist inspires us with his persistence and empathy. He doesn't force Caleb to open up or change. Instead, he offers support and patience, showing that true love isn't about pressuring someone to be different. It's about helping them find their own strength. The ending, with Caleb and the protagonist deciding to build a life together on the farm, is a reminder that it's never too late to start over. No matter how broken we feel or how much time we think we've lost, there's always a chance to find something beautiful and meaningful. It's a call to value human connections and to believe that, with effort and commitment, we can overcome any obstacle. This narrative isn't just about romance, it's about self acceptance, resilience, and the beauty of allowing yourself to be loved. It invites us to reflect on our own fears and barriers and to ask ourselves, are we living authentically, or are we hiding from our true selves? Now that you've heard this moving story, give your rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to know, what did you think of The Secrets of Caleb's Farmhouse? What moved you the most? Did you relate to any part of the story? Have you ever experienced or known someone who lived through something similar? Don't forget to share your thoughts. Your feedback means the world to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Star.